The carriage wheels struck the gravel path of Ashworth Manor just as the rain began to fall, and Eleanor Hartley gripped the handle of her worn leather case with both hands, her heart pounding as though she were walking toward danger rather than a simple job. She had never seen a house so large in her life. Its stone walls rose like cliffs against the gray sky, and its windows glowed with a warmth she knew she would never truly belong to. She was not a guest here. She was hired help, a governess, nothing more. And she reminded herself of that fact with every step she took toward the great oak doors. A tall butler named Harold opened the door before she could knock, his face unreadable, his eyes quickly measuring her plain gray dress and her modest bonnet. He did not smile. "You must be Miss Hartley," he said. "The housekeeper is expecting you. Follow me, and please, keep to the side halls. The family does not care to encounter staff in the main corridors." Eleanor nodded, saying nothing, though the words stung more than she expected. She followed him through a narrow passage lined with portraits of stern ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to judge her with every step. The manor smelled of beeswax polish and old wood, and somewhere far off she could hear the faint sound of a piano being played, delicate and sad. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Pemberton, met her in a small sitting room near the kitchens. She looked Eleanor over with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many governesses come and go. "You come highly recommended," Mrs. Pemberton said, "though I confess I was surprised the Duke chose someone so young for his daughter. Lady Grace is a gentle child, but she has been through much sorrow. Her mother passed 2 winters ago, and she has grown quiet and fearful since. You must be patient with her." "I will do my very best," Eleanor said softly. "See that you do. And Miss Hartley, a word of advice, for your own good. Keep to the nursery. Do not wander the manor uninvited, and whatever you do, avoid crossing paths with the Dowager Duchess. She rules this house more than the Duke himself, in matters of manners and society, and she has little patience for those she considers beneath her station." Eleanor swallowed hard, but nodded again. She had heard of the Dowager Duchess Constance even before arriving. Whispers carried through the small village where she had once lived with her father. The old woman was known across the county for her sharp tongue and her fierce protection of the family name. Eleanor told herself she would simply avoid her. She was here for the child, not for society, and she intended to keep her head down and do her work quietly, as she always had. That evening, Eleanor was led to the nursery, a bright room at the top of the east wing, with tall windows overlooking the gardens. A small girl sat curled in a window seat, her knees drawn to her chest, her dark curls falling over a face that seemed far too solemn for someone so young. She did not look up when Eleanor entered. "Lady Grace," Eleanor said gently, kneeling so she was at the child's eye level rather than towering over her. "My name is Eleanor. I have come to be your companion, if you will have me." Grace glanced at her with wary brown eyes, the same eyes Eleanor had glimpsed in a portrait of the late Duchess hanging in the hallway below. "Everyone leaves," Grace whispered. "My last governess left after only 2 months. She said I was too difficult." Eleanor felt something tighten in her chest, a familiar ache she recognized from her own childhood, when she too had lost a parent, and feared that everyone she loved would eventually disappear. She sat down slowly on the window seat, careful not to crowd the girl. "I am not afraid of difficult," Eleanor said. "I have faced far worse than a lonely little girl who misses her mother. I think, in time, you and I might become good friends, if you are willing to try." Grace studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust these words she had likely heard before from governesses who did not stay. Finally, she gave the smallest nod, and something in her shoulders loosened, just slightly. Over the following days, Eleanor settled into the rhythm of life at Ashworth Manor. She rose early, before the rest of the house stirred, and spent her mornings teaching Grace her letters and numbers, her afternoons walking with her through the gardens, naming flowers and birds, and her evenings reading quietly by candlelight after the child had fallen asleep. She rarely saw the rest of the family. The Duke, she was told, spent most of his days occupied with estate matters and rarely came to the nursery, though servants spoke of him with a strange mixture of respect and sympathy, for he too had lost much when his wife passed. Eleanor caught her first glimpse of the Duke on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, as she walked with Grace along a garden path lined with white roses. He was speaking with his estate manager near the stables, tall and composed, dressed simply despite his rank, his dark hair slightly disheveled from the wind. He turned briefly, and their eyes met across the distance. Eleanor quickly looked away, embarrassed to have been caught staring, but not before she noticed something unexpected in his expression. Not the cold indifference she had braced herself for, but a flicker of quiet curiosity. "That is my father," Grace said matter-of-factly, tugging at Eleanor's sleeve. "He is very busy, but he loves me very much, even when he forgets to say it." "I am certain he does," Eleanor replied, and she meant it, for she had already noticed small signs of his care: a drawing, pinned carefully above Grace's bed, a favorite doll from her mother, kept safe in a glass case in the nursery, evidence of a man who grieved quietly, but had not forgotten how to love. Days passed into a week, and Eleanor began to feel, for the first time since her father's death and the loss of the modest home she once knew, something close to steadiness. She was careful, always careful, to remain unseen by the wider household, to eat her meals in the small servants' dining area, rather than risk any unwanted attention, and to keep her presence in the great house as quiet and unremarkable as possible. She had learned early in life that people of her station survived by remaining invisible, by never giving those above them a reason to notice, let alone resent them. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. One evening, as Eleanor tucked Grace into bed after a long day of lessons and play, the girl reached out and caught her sleeve. "Miss Eleanor," Grace said, her voice small in the candlelight, "there is a big dinner tomorrow night. Father says important people are coming. My old governess always hid from me during those dinners. She said children should not be seen at grown-up parties. But I am always so frightened when strangers come. Will you hide from me too?" Eleanor brushed a curl from the girl's forehead, her heart aching at the loneliness behind the question. "I will not hide from you if you truly need me, Grace, but I do not think it is my place to attend such a dinner. That is a decision for your father to make, not for me." Grace's eyes filled with worry, but she said nothing more, only closed her eyes and drifted into an uneasy sleep. Eleanor sat beside her a moment longer, watching the candle flicker and thinking about the strange life she now led, caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. She did not yet know that the following evening would change everything, that a single dinner would test her courage, wound her pride, and yet somehow, against all reason, place her at the very center of a household she had sworn to remain invisible within. As she extinguished the candle and slipped quietly from the nursery, she had no way of knowing that the Duke himself had already begun to notice the quiet governess, who moved through his halls like a soft shadow. Nor did she know that fate, and perhaps the Duke's own growing curiosity, would soon draw her into a room she had never intended to enter, seated among nobility who would judge her before she had spoken a single word. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window panes, as if the manor itself sensed the storm that was coming, not of rain, but of pride, cruelty, and an act of kindness so unexpected it would echo through the halls of Ashworth for years to come. The next morning arrived with pale sunlight breaking through heavy clouds, and the manor buzzed with a different kind of energy than Eleanor had yet witnessed. Servants moved briskly through the corridors, carrying polished silver and fresh linens, while the cook shouted orders from the kitchen below. Eleanor learned from a young maid named Alice that the guests arriving that evening included several prominent families from the county, along with the Dowager Duchess Constance, who had been away visiting relatives and was due to return that very afternoon. "She has a temper, that one," Alice whispered as she folded a stack of napkins. "Best you stay well out of her path, Miss Hartley. She does not take kindly to new faces in the household, especially not those she considers beneath her notice." Eleanor thanked her for the warning, though she already intended to keep entirely out of sight during the evening's festivities. She spent the day as she always did, teaching Grace, walking with her in the gardens, and trying to distract the child from her growing nervousness about the guests arriving that night. But as afternoon turned to evening, and the sound of carriages began arriving on the gravel drive below, Grace grew increasingly anxious, clutching Eleanor's hand tightly as they watched from the nursery window. "I do not want to be alone tonight," Grace admitted quietly. "The house feels so big when there are strangers in it." Eleanor squeezed her hand gently. "You will not be alone, dear one. I will stay close by, I promise you that." She had every intention of keeping that promise from the safety of the nursery, watching over Grace as the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted up from the grand dining hall below. She did not yet know that within a few short hours she would be summoned from that quiet room into the very heart of the gathering she had hoped to avoid, called forward by the one person in the household whose opinion mattered most, and whose simple request would set in motion events far beyond anything Eleanor could have imagined on that quiet, rain-soaked evening when she first arrived at Ashworth Manor. The candle in the nursery burned low as night fell fully over the estate, and Eleanor sat by the window, watching carriage after carriage roll up the drive, each one carrying guests dressed in silks and jewels far beyond anything she had ever owned or hoped to own. She thought of her father, gone 2 years now, and the quiet, humble life they had shared before his passing, left her alone in the world. She thought of the long months of searching for work, the doors closed in her face, when families learned she had no fortune, no connections, nothing but her education, and her willingness to work hard. She had been grateful beyond words when the position at Ashworth Manor had been offered to her, and she intended to honor that gratitude by remaining exactly where she belonged, in the shadows, caring for a lonely child who needed her more than any grand dinner ever could. Yet even as she told herself this, some small part of her wondered what it might be like, just once, to sit among the glittering guests below, to be seen not as a servant or a burden, but simply as a person worthy of a place at the table. She pushed the thought away quickly, ashamed of her own foolishness, and turned back to comfort Grace, who had begun to cry softly, frightened by the unfamiliar sounds of the gathering downstairs. "Hush now," Eleanor whispered, gathering the child into her arms. "I am here. I will always be here when you need me." Neither of them knew that downstairs, at that very moment, the Duke of Ashworth was informed that his daughter's usual evening companion, a young nursemaid meant to sit with Grace during formal occasions, had fallen suddenly ill and could not attend. The Duke, standing near the entrance of the dining hall in his fine black coat, frowned at the news, his mind immediately turning to his daughter's fragile nerves and her fear of unfamiliar gatherings. He knew all too well how such evenings unsettled her since her mother's passing, and he had no wish to leave her frightened and alone in the nursery, while dozens of strangers filled his home below. It was then that he remembered the new governess, the quiet young woman he had glimpsed only briefly in the garden days before, the one his housekeeper had spoken of with quiet approval, praising her patience and gentle manner with Grace. Perhaps, he thought, she might be willing to bring the child down for a short while, just long enough to ease her fears before the girl was returned safely to bed. He had no idea, as he sent a servant to fetch Eleanor Hartley from the nursery, that this simple, practical decision would soon place a quiet, humble governess directly in the path of his aunt's fiercest cruelty. Nor did he know that his own response to that cruelty would forever change the course of both their lives, drawing them together, in a manner neither of them could have foreseen, on that cold and glittering evening at Ashworth Manor. A servant named Peter arrived at the nursery door, slightly out of breath from climbing the stairs quickly. He bowed his head politely to Eleanor, though his eyes carried a note of surprise, for it was unusual for anyone from the nursery to be summoned during a formal dinner. "Miss Hartley," he said, "the Duke requests that you bring Lady Grace down to the dining hall. Her usual companion has taken ill, and His Grace does not wish the child to be frightened or left alone this evening." Eleanor's heart quickened with unease. She looked down at Grace, whose small face had lit up with sudden hope at the mention of being near her father. "Are you certain?" Eleanor asked carefully. "I would not wish to intrude upon the family's evening." "His Grace was quite clear in his instructions," Peter replied. "You are simply to bring the child down and remain with her at the far end of the table, out of the way of the main gathering. It will only be for a short while, until Lady Grace feels settled." Eleanor hesitated only a moment longer before nodding. She could not, in good conscience, refuse a direct request from the Duke himself, nor could she bear to disappoint Grace, whose fear of loneliness had already caused her so much distress. She quickly smoothed the child's hair, straightened her own plain gray dress as best she could, and took Grace's small hand in hers. "Come along then," she said softly. "Let us see your father, just for a little while." As they descended the grand staircase together, Eleanor felt increasingly aware of how out of place she looked among the polished marble and gleaming chandeliers of the manor's public rooms. She had never before ventured into this part of the house, and the sheer scale of it, the towering ceilings painted with scenes of angels and clouds, the endless portraits of ancestors staring down with cold, judging eyes, made her feel smaller with every step. Grace, however, seemed to draw strength from Eleanor's steady presence, gripping her hand tightly, but walking with more confidence than she had shown in days. The dining hall itself took Eleanor's breath away. though not entirely with wonder. Long tables draped in white linen stretched beneath a ceiling ablaze with candlelight, surrounded by guests dressed in the finest silks and velvets Eleanor had ever seen. Laughter and conversation filled the air, along with the clink of crystal glasses and silver cutlery. She felt every eye that happened to glance her way linger a moment too long, taking in her simple dress, her lack of jewels, the unmistakable signs of a woman who did not belong among them. The Duke rose from his place near the head of the table as they entered, and Eleanor noticed, with some relief, that his expression held nothing but warmth as he looked toward his daughter. "There you are," he said gently, crossing the room to kneel briefly before Grace. "I am glad you have come down, my dear. I know these gatherings can feel overwhelming, but I did not wish you to be frightened alone upstairs." "Thank you, Father," Grace whispered, some of the tension leaving her small shoulders. The Duke straightened and turned his attention briefly to Eleanor, offering her a polite nod. "Miss Hartley, I am grateful for your willingness to accompany her on such short notice. Please, take a seat near the end of the table with Grace. I will have the staff bring a light meal for you both." Eleanor curtsied respectfully, murmuring her thanks, and led Grace toward the far end of the long table, as instructed, seating themselves in the quieter corner reserved for children and their companions during formal occasions. She had hoped, perhaps foolishly, that they might remain unnoticed there, tucked away from the glittering crowd of guests seated closer to the head of the table where the Duke presided. For a time, it seemed her hope might be realized. The meal proceeded smoothly, course after course of rich soups, roasted meats, and delicate pastries passing before them, far grander than anything Eleanor had eaten in years. Grace, comforted by her father's occasional glances down the table, and by Eleanor's steady presence beside her, began to relax, even smiling faintly at a joke Eleanor whispered about the elaborate feathered hat worn by one of the older guests. But comfort, Eleanor would soon learn, was a fragile thing within the walls of Ashworth Manor. It was during the fourth course, as servants cleared away plates of roasted pheasant, that the grand doors at the far end of the hall opened, and a hush fell briefly over the room. Eleanor looked up along with everyone else and saw a tall, elegant woman enter, dressed in deep burgundy silk, her silver hair swept into an elaborate style crowned with a delicate tiara. Her posture was rigid, her chin lifted with the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to commanding every room she entered. Eleanor did not need to be told who this woman was. The Dowager Duchess Constance had arrived. The Duke rose politely to greet his aunt, exchanging brief words of welcome as servants hurried to arrange a place for her, near the head of the table. Constance's sharp eyes swept across the assembled guests, taking careful stock of who sat where, who wore what, and who, in her estimation, did or did not belong among such distinguished company. It did not take long for her gaze to drift toward the far end of the table, where Eleanor sat quietly beside Grace. Eleanor felt the older woman's stare settle upon her like a physical weight, cold and assessing. She kept her own eyes lowered respectfully, hoping the moment would pass without incident, but she could sense, even without looking up, that the Duchess's attention had not moved on. "Who?" Constance asked loudly enough for half the table to hear, her voice cutting cleanly through the low murmur of conversation. "Is that woman seated with dear Grace? I do not recognize her among our usual company." A ripple of curious glances turned toward Eleanor, and she felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment despite her best efforts to remain composed. The Duke, seated closer to his aunt, answered calmly, "That is Miss Hartley, Grace's new governess. Her usual companion for the evening fell ill, so I asked Miss Hartley to bring her down, rather than leave her frightened and alone." Constance's thin eyebrows rose, and a small, cold smile touched her lips, the kind of smile that carried no warmth whatsoever. A governess, dining at the family table? How very unusual. In my day, hired help understood their place well enough to remain out of sight during formal occasions. The words landed like a slap, though Eleanor forced herself to remain still, her hands folded quietly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth before her. Grace, sensing the sudden tension, reached instinctively for Eleanor's hand beneath the table, gripping it tightly. "Aunt Constance," the Duke said, his tone carrying the faintest note of warning. "Miss Hartley is here at my request, and Grace is comforted by her presence. I see no reason for concern." But Constance was not so easily silenced. She had built her reputation over decades on the strength of her sharp tongue, and her unwavering belief in the importance of rank and station, and she had no intention of allowing what she considered a glaring breach of propriety to pass without comment. She turned her attention more fully toward Eleanor, studying her plain dress, her unadorned hair, her modest bearing, with open and deliberate disdain. "Tell me, Miss Hartley," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "do you often dine among your betters, or is this a rare privilege granted only when the household finds itself short of proper company?" A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, sensing the cruelty behind the question, though none dared speak against the formidable Dowager Duchess. Eleanor felt her throat tighten, humiliation burning hot in her chest, but she lifted her chin slightly and answered as steadily as she could manage. "I am here only to comfort Lady Grace this evening, Your Grace. I have no wish to intrude upon the company, and I will happily return upstairs the moment she feels settled." "How gracious of you," Constance replied with a thin, mocking smile, clearly unsatisfied by Eleanor's calm response. "Though I confess, I find it rather remarkable that a governess of your circumstances should find herself seated so near the family, wearing such a plain and unremarkable dress at that. One might almost mistake you for a servant who wandered into the wrong room entirely." Several guests near enough to hear the remark exchanged uncomfortable glances, and a young woman across the table lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed on Eleanor's behalf. Eleanor felt the heat of humiliation rise in her cheeks, but she kept her composure, her hands folded tightly in her lap beneath the table, where no one could see them tremble. "I am a governess, Your Grace," Eleanor said quietly, her voice steady, despite the storm of emotion beneath the surface. "I have never claimed to be anything more, nor do I wish to be. My only concern this evening is for Lady Grace's comfort." But Constance, emboldened by the silence of the room and the absence of any real challenge to her authority, pressed further, her voice rising just enough to ensure the entire table could hear her words clearly. "Comfort," she repeated with a small, cold laugh. "How touching. Though I wonder, does comfort truly require a place at this table, among guests of noble birth and family name? Perhaps it would be more fitting, Miss Hartley, if you took your meal in the kitchens where you belong, and left Lady Grace in the care of someone more suited to formal company." The room fell into an uncomfortable, heavy silence. Eleanor felt every eye upon her, felt the weight of judgment pressing down from all sides, and for a moment, she feared she might simply rise and flee the hall entirely, humiliation overwhelming her carefully held composure. Grace, beside her, had gone very still, her small fingers gripping Eleanor's hand so tightly it nearly hurt. It was then, in that heavy, suffocating silence, that the Duke of Ashworth rose slowly from his seat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed not on his aunt, but on the quiet, humiliated young woman seated at the far end of the room, whose calm dignity in the face of such cruelty had not gone unnoticed by him, nor, it seemed, by several other guests seated nearby, all of whom now watched with bated breath to see what their host would do next. The Duke did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His tall figure alone, rising slowly and deliberately from his seat, commanded the attention of every guest in the hall, and the room seemed to hold its breath as he stepped away from his chair and began walking, unhurried, along the length of the table, toward the quiet corner where Eleanor and Grace sat frozen in place. Constance watched her nephew's approach with narrowed eyes, clearly uncertain what he intended, though her confidence did not waver, for she had never in her life been truly challenged within these walls. She lifted her chin higher, expecting perhaps a quiet word of correction directed at the governess, a private reprimand meant to smooth over the awkwardness she herself had created. Instead, the Duke stopped directly beside Eleanor's chair, and with a gentleness that surprised everyone watching, he extended his hand toward her. "Miss Hartley," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent hall, "would you do me the honor of joining me at the head of the table? There is a seat beside me that has remained empty since my wife passed, and I can think of no one more deserving of it this evening than the woman who has shown my daughter more genuine kindness in a few short days than she has known in 2 long years." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled guests. Eleanor stared up at him, stunned into silence, uncertain whether she had heard him correctly. Grace, beside her, looked up with wide, hopeful eyes, and even in her shock, Eleanor felt the girl's small hand tighten encouragingly around hers, as if urging her to accept. "Your Grace," Eleanor managed to say softly, I could not possibly. I insist, the Duke said gently, though there was steel beneath the softness of his tone, a quiet firmness that left no room for argument. Character, Miss Hartley, is not measured by the fabric of one's dress or the length of one's family name. It is measured by kindness, by patience, and by the courage to remain dignified in the face of unkindness. You have shown all three tonight, and I will not have a guest in my home, however elevated her station, insult a woman who has done nothing but care for my daughter with genuine devotion. The silence in the hall deepened, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint crackle of candles burning in their silver holders. Constance's face had gone pale, then flushed a deep, furious red, her hands gripping the edge of the table as though she might rise and object, yet even she seemed momentarily at a loss for words in the face of her nephew's calm, unwavering resolve. Slowly, hesitantly, Eleanor rose from her chair, Grace's hand still clasped in hers. She glanced down the long table at the sea of unfamiliar faces, some curious, some sympathetic, a few clearly scandalized by the unfolding scene. She felt her heart pounding wildly in her chest, torn between the instinct to flee back to the safety of the nursery and the quiet, undeniable pull of the Duke's steady gaze, which held nothing but sincerity. "Come," the Duke said softly, offering his arm. "Both of you." With Grace clinging to her other hand, Eleanor allowed herself to be led the length of the grand table, past dozens of curious eyes, to the seat of honor, beside the Duke of Ashworth himself. She settled into the chair with as much composure as she could summon, though her cheeks burned with the awareness of every gaze fixed upon her, and Grace quickly climbed into the smaller chair arranged beside her father, clearly relieved and delighted by this sudden turn of events. Constance, still seated near the head of the table, could no longer contain her outrage. "Nephew," she hissed, leaning toward him, her voice low but sharp enough to carry. "You cannot possibly mean to seat a common governess at the family's place of honor. Think of what this will do to our standing among these guests. Think of what people will say." The Duke turned to face his aunt fully, and though his tone remained calm and measured, there was an unmistakable firmness in his words that silenced even her considerable will. "Aunt Constance, I have spent 2 years thinking only of what people will say, of preserving appearances, of upholding a standard that brought my late wife little comfort, and my daughter even less. Tonight, I find myself far more concerned with what is right than with what is fashionable. Miss Hartley has shown my daughter more warmth in a matter of days than this house has seen in far too long. I will not apologize for honoring that." A murmur passed through the assembled guests, and Eleanor, seated now at the Duke's side, felt an overwhelming mixture of gratitude, embarrassment, and disbelief wash over her in equal measure. She dared a glance toward him, and found him already looking at her, his expression softening into something almost gentle, almost warm. "Thank you," she whispered, so quietly that only he could hear. "There is no need to thank me," he replied, just as softly. "I only regret that my aunt's words caused you distress in the first place. You have done nothing tonight but show my daughter kindness, and kindness, Miss Hartley, should never be met with cruelty." The remainder of the dinner passed in an atmosphere thick with tension, though the conversation gradually resumed among the other guests, many of them stealing curious glances toward the far end of the table where the quiet governess now sat in the seat once reserved for the Duke's late wife. Some guests seemed genuinely charmed by the unexpected turn of events, whispering admiringly about the Duke's evident compassion, while others, clearly loyal to Constance and mindful of her considerable influence within county society, regarded Eleanor with thinly veiled suspicion, wondering what manner of woman could so quickly capture the attention of a man known for his reserved and grieving nature. Constance herself said little for the remainder of the meal, though her silence carried a weight far heavier than any spoken word. She sat rigid and pale, her fork barely touching her plate, her eyes occasionally flicking toward Eleanor with an expression of cold, simmering resentment that promised the matter was far from settled. Eleanor noticed this, even amid her own lingering shock, and a small chill ran through her despite the warmth of the candlelit hall. She understood, with the quiet instinct of someone who had learned early in life to read the moods of those with power over her, that the Dowager Duchess would not easily forgive this public humiliation, nor would she allow the matter to rest without some attempt to reclaim her authority within the household. When the final course had been cleared, and the guests began to rise from the table, drifting toward the drawing room for music and conversation, the Duke turned to Eleanor with a gentle smile. "I imagine Grace is growing tired," he said, glancing fondly at his daughter, whose eyelids had indeed begun to droop against the late hour. "Perhaps you might see her settled for the night. I know this evening has been eventful, and I thank you again for your patience and grace throughout it." Eleanor rose, gathering Grace gently into her arms as the child stretched and yawned, clearly worn out from the excitement of the evening. "Thank you, Your Grace, for your kindness. I confess I did not expect such a welcome tonight." "Nor did I expect to give one," the Duke admitted with a faint, wry smile. "But I find I have little patience left for cruelty disguised as tradition. Good night, Miss Hartley. I trust you will sleep well." "Good night, Your Grace," Eleanor replied. And with Grace's small hand once again tucked into her own, she made her way from the dining hall, feeling the weight of dozens of curious eyes following her departure, none more intense than those of the Dowager Duchess Constance, who watched from her seat, with an expression that promised the evening's events were far from forgotten. As Eleanor climbed the grand staircase, with Grace drowsy and content beside her, she allowed herself, for the first time that night, to breathe deeply and consider all that had transpired. She had come to Ashworth Manor intending to remain invisible, to serve quietly and without incident, yet, in a single evening, she had been publicly humiliated by one of the most powerful women in the county, and just as publicly defended by the very Duke she had sworn to keep her distance from. She did not know what the days ahead might bring, whether the Duchess's anger would fade or fester, whether the Duke's kindness tonight had been a simple act of decency, or something deeper stirring beneath the surface. Yet she could not deny the warmth that lingered in her chest, nor the quiet hope, however fragile, that perhaps she had found, in this grand and unfamiliar house, a place where she truly belonged. She settled Grace into bed a short while later, tucking the blankets snugly around her small shoulders, and brushing a gentle kiss against her forehead, a habit she had begun without quite realizing it, born of genuine affection rather than mere duty. "Miss Eleanor," Grace murmured sleepily, her eyes already closing. "Father likes you." "I could tell." Eleanor smiled softly, smoothing the girl's dark curls. "Your father is a kind man, Grace. He was simply protecting you tonight, as any good father would." "No," Grace insisted through a yawn. "It was more than that. I saw how he looked at you." Eleanor said nothing further, merely pressing another gentle kiss to the child's forehead and extinguishing the candle beside her bed. Yet as she made her way to her own small room adjoining the nursery, Grace's sleepy words echoed in her mind, stirring feelings she was not yet ready to examine too closely. She told herself firmly that the Duke had acted only out of a sense of justice and fairness, nothing more, and that she would be wise to guard her heart carefully in the days ahead, particularly given the powerful enemy she had unknowingly made that very evening. Little did she know, as she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, that the Dowager Duchess Constance remained awake long into the night, pacing the length of her private chambers, her mind already turning over plans and schemes designed to remove the quiet governess from Ashworth Manor entirely, convinced beyond doubt that Eleanor Hartley posed a far greater threat to the family's honor and standing than anyone in that grand dining hall could possibly have imagined. Word of the previous night's dinner spread through Ashworth Manor faster than the morning frost that settled over its gardens. By the time Eleanor descended to fetch Grace's breakfast tray, she noticed the way the kitchen maids fell quiet as she entered, their eyes darting toward her with a mixture of curiosity and cautious respect. A young footman named Simon offered her a small, encouraging smile as he passed, and even the stern housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, regarded her with something new in her expression, a flicker of surprise that softened, however slightly, into approval. "You have caused quite a stir, Miss Hartley," Mrs. Pemberton said as Eleanor collected a tray of warm bread and tea. "The whole staff is talking of nothing else this morning. I confess I did not expect His Grace to intervene so directly, nor so publicly." "I did not ask for such attention," Eleanor said quietly, feeling the familiar warmth of embarrassment creeping into her cheeks. "I only hope it does not cause further difficulty." Mrs. Pemberton's expression grew more serious. "A word of caution then, dear. The Dowager Duchess is not a woman who forgets a slight, real or imagined. She left her chambers early this morning, and I have already heard whispers that she intends to speak with His Grace at length today. Tread carefully, Miss Hartley. Whatever kindness the Duke showed you last night, it has made you a target in the eyes of a very powerful woman." Eleanor thanked her for the warning, though the words settled uneasily in her stomach as she carried the tray back up to the nursery. She found Grace already awake, sitting cross-legged on her bed, her dark curls tousled from sleep, humming a cheerful little tune that Eleanor had not heard from her before. "You seem happy this morning," Eleanor observed, setting down the tray and pouring a cup of tea. "Father came to see me before you woke," Grace said brightly. "He does not usually visit so early. He said he wanted to make certain I had slept well after last night. He has never done that before, not since Mother died." Eleanor felt a small, unexpected flutter in her chest at this news, quickly suppressing it with the reminder that the Duke's concern was, quite naturally, for his daughter's well-being, nothing more. Yet as the day progressed, she found herself thinking of him more often than she cared to admit, recalling the steady warmth in his eyes as he had extended his hand to her the previous evening, the quiet firmness in his voice as he defended her against his aunt's cruelty. She did not have long to dwell on such thoughts, however, for early that afternoon, as she and Grace sat together in the schoolroom practicing letters, a sharp knock sounded at the door, and without waiting for a response, the Dowager Duchess Constance swept into the room, her burgundy skirts rustling with barely contained fury. Grace shrank back slightly in her seat, and Eleanor instinctively moved closer to the child, placing a protective hand upon her small shoulder. "Leave us," Constance commanded, her sharp eyes fixed entirely upon Eleanor, ignoring Grace altogether. "I wish to speak with the governess alone." "Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully, rising to her feet, while keeping Grace close beside her. "Perhaps it would be best if we spoke after Lady Grace's lessons are complete. I do not wish to interrupt her studies." "I did not ask for your opinion on the matter," Constance snapped, her composure fraying at the edges. "I said, leave us." Grace looked up at Eleanor with wide, anxious eyes, clearly frightened by the older woman's harsh tone. Eleanor knelt briefly beside her, speaking in a low, reassuring voice. "Why do not you go find Alice in the kitchen, dear? I believe she promised to show you how to arrange flowers for the table. I will join you shortly." Grace hesitated only a moment before nodding and slipping quietly from the room, casting one final worried glance back at Eleanor, before disappearing down the corridor. Once the child was safely out of earshot, Constance turned her full attention upon Eleanor, her expression cold and calculating. "I will speak plainly, Miss Hartley," she began, her voice low and sharp as a blade, "for I have little patience for pretense. You have inserted yourself into this family with remarkable speed, charming my nephew with your quiet humility, no doubt calculated most carefully to win his sympathy. I have seen women of your sort before, governesses and companions who set their sights far above their station, hoping to secure a comfortable future through the affections of a grieving, vulnerable widower." Eleanor felt a flash of indignation rise within her, though she forced herself to remain calm and measured in her response. "Your Grace, I assure you, I have no such intentions. I came to Ashworth Manor for one reason only, to care for Lady Grace, a task I have devoted myself to fully since my arrival. Nothing more." "So you say," Constance replied with a thin, humorless smile. "Yet I saw the way my nephew looked at you last night, a look I have not seen from him since before his wife's passing. I will not stand idly by and watch a common governess maneuver her way into a position far beyond her rightful place, threatening the honor and standing of this family in the process." "I have done nothing to encourage such attention," Eleanor said firmly, though her heart pounded with the effort of maintaining her composure under the Duchess's relentless glare. "His Grace acted only out of kindness and fairness last night, nothing more. I have given him no cause to believe otherwise, nor do I intend to." Constance studied her for a long, silent moment, as though weighing the sincerity of her words, though her expression remained skeptical and cold. "Perhaps you believe that now, Miss Hartley. But mark my words, I have watched this family's honor upheld for 3 generations, and I will not allow it to be tarnished by a penniless governess with ambitions beyond her station. Whether those ambitions are spoken aloud or not, I suggest you consider carefully whether your continued presence in this household is truly worth the trouble it may bring upon you." With that, the Duchess turned sharply and swept from the room, leaving Eleanor standing alone amid the scattered papers and half-finished letters of Grace's morning lesson, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of anger, humiliation, and a growing sense of unease. She sank slowly into a nearby chair, taking several deep breaths to steady herself, her mind racing over the veiled threat behind the Duchess's final words. She had come to Ashworth Manor, seeking only quiet, honest work, a place to rebuild some small measure of stability after the loss of her father and the collapse of the modest life they had once shared. She had never intended to draw attention to herself, let alone become the center of a conflict between the Duke and his formidable aunt. Yet here she found herself, caught in precisely such a predicament, uncertain how to proceed without either abandoning her charge, whom she had grown genuinely fond of in such a short time, or risking the wrath of a woman clearly capable of making her life exceedingly difficult. That evening, after Grace had been settled for the night, Eleanor found herself restless, unable to shake the unsettling encounter from her thoughts. She wandered down to the small garden terrace behind the manor, hoping the cool evening air might calm her troubled mind. She had not expected to find the Duke there as well, standing alone near the stone balustrade, gazing out over the darkened grounds with an expression of quiet contemplation. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, and a faint, welcoming smile crossed his face. "Miss Hartley, I did not expect to find you out here at this hour." "Forgive me, Your Grace," Eleanor said quickly, dropping into a respectful curtsy. "I did not mean to intrude upon your solitude. I will leave you to your thoughts." "Please stay," he said gently, gesturing toward the balustrade beside him. "I find I could use the company, if you are willing to offer it." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before stepping closer, standing a respectful distance from him, as they both gazed out over the moonlit gardens. For a while, neither spoke, the silence between them comfortable rather than strained, until finally the Duke broke it, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "I owe you an apology, Miss Hartley," he said, "for the unpleasantness you endured last night at my aunt's hands. I had hoped my response might discourage further cruelty, though I fear I may have only complicated matters further for you." Eleanor glanced at him, surprised by his candor. "You need not apologize, Your Grace. You showed me a kindness I did not expect, nor do I believe I deserved such a public defense. Though I confess, your aunt did visit me today, and made her displeasure quite clear." The Duke's expression darkened slightly, concern replacing the earlier warmth in his eyes. "What did she say to you?" Eleanor hesitated, reluctant to cause further conflict within the family, yet something in his steady, sincere gaze encouraged honesty. "She suggested, quite plainly, that my continued presence here threatens the family's honor, and that I would do well to consider whether remaining at Ashworth Manor is truly worth the trouble it may bring upon me." A muscle tightened in the Duke's jaw, and for a moment, Eleanor glimpsed a flash of genuine anger beneath his usually composed exterior. "My aunt oversteps her bounds," he said firmly. "You are here at my invitation, Miss Hartley, and your position within this household is not hers to threaten or dictate. I will speak with her directly on this matter." "Please," Eleanor said quickly, placing a gentle hand upon his arm before quickly withdrawing it, embarrassed by her own boldness. "I do not wish to cause further division within your family on my account. I am grateful for your support, truly, but I fear intervening further may only deepen her resentment toward me." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something softening in his expression as he considered her words. "You are remarkably selfless, Miss Hartley, to concern yourself with my family's harmony, even as you endure such treatment. Grace adores you, you know. I have not seen her smile so freely in 2 long years, not since her mother passed. Whatever difficulties my aunt may cause, I assure you, your place here is secure for as long as you wish to remain." Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest at his words, along with a quiet, cautious hope she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. "Thank you, Your Grace. That means more to me than I can properly express." They stood together in comfortable silence a while longer, the moonlight casting a soft glow over the darkened gardens, before Eleanor finally excused herself to return to the nursery, leaving the Duke alone once more with his thoughts. Neither of them spoke of the growing warmth developing quietly between them, though both, in their own private moments, found themselves thinking of the other far more often than either might have expected only days before. Yet even as this fragile connection began to take root, the Dowager Duchess Constance remained resolute in her determination to see the governess removed from Ashworth Manor entirely, already beginning to lay the groundwork for a scheme far more calculated and dangerous than a simple sharp word at the dinner table. one that would soon test not only Eleanor's courage and integrity, but the very strength of the bond quietly forming between her and the Duke she had begun, against her own better judgment, to care for far more deeply than she had ever intended. News of the dinner incident traveled quickly beyond the walls of Ashworth Manor, carried by departing guests into the drawing rooms and parlors of the county's finest families. Within days, Eleanor's name had become the subject of quiet gossip among the local nobility, whispered over afternoon tea and exchanged in careful letters between old friends. Some spoke of the Duke's actions with admiration, praising his evident compassion and fairness, while others, particularly those loyal to the formidable Dowager Duchess, regarded the entire affair with suspicion, wondering aloud what manner of woman could so quickly disrupt the careful order of one of the county's most respected households. Eleanor remained largely unaware of the full extent of this gossip, occupied as she was with her daily responsibilities toward Grace, though she noticed subtle changes in the way the household staff treated her. Some, like young Alice and the kindly footman Simon, grew warmer and more open in their interactions, clearly charmed by the story of the Duke's gallant defense. Others, however, particularly those who had long served under the Dowager Duchess's watchful eye, regarded Eleanor with renewed wariness, uncertain whether to align themselves with the governess who had unexpectedly risen in favor, or with the powerful woman who still held considerable influence over the household's affairs. A fortnight after the dinner, the Duke informed Eleanor that a smaller gathering had been arranged, a modest afternoon tea, intended to smooth over any lingering tension among the county's families following the dramatic events of the previous fortnight. Eleanor was surprised, and more than a little apprehensive, when he requested that she and Grace attend once again, though this time the invitation carried an air of quiet confidence rather than desperate necessity. "I understand your hesitation," the Duke said gently, finding her in the garden one afternoon as she walked with Grace among the roses. "But I believe it important that our neighbors see for themselves that Grace's happiness, and your place within this household, are not subjects open to debate or gossip. I would consider it a personal favor if you would join us." Eleanor glanced down at Grace, who looked up at her with wide, hopeful eyes, clearly eager for Eleanor's company at the gathering. "If it would ease your mind, your Grace, and bring comfort to Grace, then I will attend, though I confess, I have little experience navigating such social occasions." "You need only be yourself," the Duke said with a warm smile. "That has proven more than sufficient thus far." The afternoon of the gathering arrived bright and clear, the manor's grand drawing room filled with the soft murmur of polite conversation, as guests arrived in twos and threes, exchanging pleasantries over delicate china cups and trays of small cakes. Eleanor, dressed in her one good dress of pale blue, a modest improvement upon her usual gray, felt the familiar flutter of nervousness as she entered the room, with Grace at her side, though she reminded herself firmly of the Duke's steady encouragement and Grace's evident happiness in her company. To her considerable relief, several guests greeted her with genuine warmth, curious about the young woman who had so quickly captured the Duke's evident respect. A kindly older gentleman named Mr. Whitfield, a longtime friend of the late Duke's father, engaged her in pleasant conversation about her education and her impressions of the county, seeming genuinely charmed by her thoughtful, unpretentious manner. A young married woman named Mrs. Winslow complimented her patience with Grace, noting how much brighter and more animated the child seemed compared to previous encounters. Yet not all the attention Eleanor received that afternoon was so kindly meant. She noticed, from across the room, the Dowager Duchess Constance watching her with narrowed, calculating eyes, occasionally leaning close to whisper something to a small cluster of guests gathered near her, their eyes flicking toward Eleanor, with expressions ranging from curiosity to open suspicion. Eleanor did her best to ignore these glances, focusing instead on Grace's comfort and the pleasant conversations offered by the more welcoming guests, yet a persistent unease settled in her stomach as the afternoon wore on. It was during a quiet lull in the gathering, as guests mingled near the tall windows overlooking the garden, that Eleanor overheard a fragment of conversation that chilled her considerably. Constance's voice, though lowered, carried just enough for Eleanor to catch as she passed nearby, ostensibly fetching a fresh cup of tea for Grace. "Cannot possibly trust a woman of such uncertain background," the Duchess was saying to a small group of attentive listeners. "One wonders what precisely she hopes to gain from her position here, beyond the obvious. I have made certain inquiries into her past, and I dare say the results may prove most illuminating before long." Eleanor's blood ran cold at these words, though she forced herself to continue walking, her expression carefully neutral despite the anxious pounding of her heart. She had nothing to hide, certainly, nothing but the ordinary hardships of a modest upbringing and the loss of her father, yet the deliberate menace behind the Duchess's words left her deeply unsettled, uncertain what manner of inquiries the powerful woman might have set in motion, or what she might hope to uncover or fabricate in her determination to see Eleanor removed from the household entirely. She did not speak of this overheard conversation to the Duke that evening, reluctant to burden him further with his aunt's evident hostility, nor did she wish to appear as though she sought his protection through complaint rather than through her own quiet dignity and hard work. Yet the unease lingered within her over the following days, a persistent shadow at the edges of her otherwise contented routine with Grace, as she wondered what form the Duchess's threatened scheme might eventually take, and whether her own carefully guarded past held anything at all that might be twisted into a weapon against her. As it happened, Eleanor's past held nothing scandalous, nothing beyond the simple, honest struggles of a young woman left orphaned and impoverished following her father's untimely death, his modest savings lost to unwise investments made in his final, grief-stricken years after Eleanor's mother had passed. Yet she understood, with the clear-eyed pragmatism born of hardship, that truth mattered little to those determined to see a particular outcome, and that a woman as powerful and resourceful as the Dowager Duchess Constance could, if sufficiently motivated, fabricate scandal from even the most innocent circumstances. Her fears proved well-founded sooner than she might have expected. Less than a week after the tea gathering, as Eleanor returned from an afternoon walk with Grace through the Manor's extensive gardens, she was met at the nursery door by Mrs. Pemberton, whose usually composed expression carried an unmistakable note of concern. "Miss Hartley," the housekeeper said quietly, drawing Eleanor a short distance away from Grace, who had run ahead to retrieve a favorite doll from the schoolroom. "I must speak with you privately, and I fear the news is not good." Eleanor felt her stomach tighten with dread. "What has happened, Mrs. Pemberton?" The housekeeper glanced cautiously down the corridor, before continuing in a low, urgent whisper. "The Dowager Duchess has informed His Grace this very morning that a valuable piece of jewelry has gone missing from her private chambers, a sapphire brooch that belonged to her late mother. She claims to have last seen it the evening of the dinner party, and she has suggested, quite openly, that you were seen near her chambers earlier that same day." Eleanor's heart plummeted, a cold wave of shock and disbelief washing over her. "That is entirely untrue, Mrs. Pemberton. I have never once set foot near the Duchess's private chambers, not on that day nor any other. I would not even know where to find them within this house." "I believe you, Miss Hartley," Mrs. Pemberton said gently, though her expression remained troubled. "You have shown nothing but honesty and diligence since your arrival here, and I have served this household long enough to recognize the difference between genuine wrongdoing and a carefully constructed accusation. But I fear the Duchess intends to press the matter quite seriously, and she has already requested that His Grace order a thorough search of your quarters." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face, humiliation and fear tightening around her chest like an iron band. Surely His Grace does not believe such an accusation. "I cannot say what he believes," Mrs. Pemberton admitted honestly, "though I have known him since he was a boy, and he has always possessed a keen sense of fairness. I do not believe he will condemn you without proper cause. But you must prepare yourself, Miss Hartley, for a difficult confrontation ahead. The Duchess is not a woman who abandons a scheme once set in motion, and I fear this accusation, however baseless, may prove far more dangerous to your position here than any sharp words spoken at a dinner table." Eleanor thanked the housekeeper for her honesty and her evident sympathy, though her mind raced with anxious uncertainty as she returned to the nursery, where Grace waited with her doll, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering around the woman she had grown to love and trust so completely. Eleanor forced a calm, reassuring smile for the child's sake, though inwardly, she braced herself for the confrontation she now understood to be inevitable, uncertain whether her quiet dignity and honest character would prove sufficient to withstand the calculated cruelty of a woman determined, by any means necessary, to see her removed from Ashworth Manor entirely. The summons came that very evening, delivered by a solemn-faced footman who informed Eleanor that the Duke required her presence in his private study without delay. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her dress and followed the servant through the winding corridors of the manor, her mind racing through every possible explanation she might offer, though she knew, with a sinking certainty, that innocence alone might not prove sufficient against the determined machinations of the Dowager Duchess. The study, when she entered, felt smaller and more intimate than the grand public rooms of the manor, lined with tall bookshelves and warmed by a crackling fire in the hearth. The Duke stood near the window, his expression grave, while Constance sat rigidly in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her hands folded primly in her lap, though her eyes glittered with poorly concealed satisfaction as Eleanor entered the room. "Miss Hartley," the Duke said, his voice carefully measured, though Eleanor detected an undercurrent of discomfort beneath his formal tone. "My aunt has brought a serious matter to my attention. A valuable brooch belonging to her late mother has gone missing from her private chambers, and she believes you may possess some knowledge of its whereabouts." Eleanor met his gaze steadily, though her heart pounded fiercely in her chest. "Your Grace, I assure you, on my honor, I know nothing whatsoever of this missing brooch. I have never once entered the Duchess's private chambers, nor would I have any reason to do so." "How convenient," Constance interjected sharply, her voice dripping with cold sarcasm. "A servant girl professes innocence, and we are simply expected to believe her without question, despite the fact that she was seen wandering the upper corridors near my chambers on the very afternoon the brooch disappeared." "I was nowhere near your chambers that afternoon, Your Grace," Eleanor said firmly, though carefully, mindful of maintaining respect, even as indignation burned within her. "I spent that entire afternoon in the schoolroom with Lady Grace, practicing her letters, as Mrs. Pemberton and several of the household staff can readily confirm." "Perhaps your memory of that particular afternoon is simply mistaken," Constance replied smoothly. "Or perhaps those you claim as witnesses are simply protecting one of their own, sympathetic to your circumstances. Either way, the brooch is missing, and you remain the only new addition to this household since it was last seen." The Duke's brow furrowed, his gaze shifting thoughtfully between his aunt and Eleanor, clearly troubled by the conflicting accounts before him. "Aunt Constance, who precisely claims to have seen Miss Hartley near your chambers that afternoon?" Constance hesitated only briefly before answering. "My personal maid, Beatrice, mentioned noticing an unfamiliar figure near my door while attending to my wardrobe that day. She could not say with absolute certainty it was Miss Hartley, but the timing aligns most suspiciously." "An unfamiliar figure, glimpsed uncertainly, hardly constitutes proof of theft," the Duke said carefully, though his tone remained measured and fair. "I would like to speak with Beatrice directly, and I would also like Mrs. Pemberton to confirm Miss Hartley's whereabouts that afternoon, as she has claimed." Constance's expression flickered with something close to irritation, quickly masked beneath a veneer of wounded dignity. "Nephew, surely you do not intend to interrogate the entire household over a simple matter of missing jewelry. I have made my concerns known, and I trust you to act with appropriate decisiveness in protecting this family's interests." "I intend to act with fairness, Aunt Constance," the Duke replied evenly, "which requires that I gather all relevant facts before drawing any conclusions. I will not dismiss a member of my household on the basis of an uncertain sighting and an unproven accusation, however serious the matter of the missing brooch may be." Eleanor felt a small measure of relief at his words, though the tension in the room remained thick and uncomfortable. The Duke turned to a nearby servant and instructed him to fetch both Mrs. Pemberton and the Duchess's maid, Beatrice, for immediate questioning. As they waited in strained silence, Constance's eyes remained fixed upon Eleanor with an expression of cold, calculating hostility that left no doubt as to her continued determination to see the governess removed, regardless of whatever facts might emerge from the coming inquiry. Mrs. Pemberton arrived first, her expression composed despite the evident tension in the room, and confirmed without hesitation that Eleanor had spent the entirety of the afternoon in question within the schoolroom, teaching Lady Grace her letters, a fact she herself had personally witnessed while delivering afternoon refreshments to the pair. Beatrice arrived shortly after, a nervous young woman who fidgeted uncomfortably beneath the weight of the Duke's careful, patient questioning. When pressed for specific details regarding the figure she claimed to have seen near the Duchess's chambers, her certainty wavered considerably, and she eventually admitted, with evident reluctance, that she had only glimpsed the figure briefly from a distance, and that in truth, she could not say with any confidence whether the person she had seen was Eleanor at all, or perhaps another member of the household staff entirely. "I only meant to be helpful," Beatrice said anxiously, glancing nervously toward the Duchess, whose expression had grown increasingly rigid with barely contained frustration. Her Grace asked me directly whether I had seen anyone unfamiliar near her chambers, and I mentioned the figure I had glimpsed, though I never meant to accuse Miss Hartley specifically. The Duke turned slowly toward his aunt, his expression carefully controlled, though Eleanor detected a distinct note of disappointment beneath his measured tone. "It seems, Aunt Constance, that your accusation rests upon considerably less solid ground than you initially suggested. Miss Hartley's whereabouts that afternoon are confirmed beyond doubt by Mrs. Pemberton's own testimony, and your maid herself admits she cannot identify the figure she saw with any certainty." Constance's composure finally cracked, her carefully maintained dignity giving way to open frustration. "Nephew, surely you do not intend to simply dismiss the matter entirely. The brooch remains missing regardless of these uncertain testimonies." "The brooch's disappearance is indeed troubling," the Duke agreed calmly, "and I will certainly order a proper search of the household to determine what has become of it. But I will not condemn Miss Hartley on the basis of evidence that has, upon closer examination, proven entirely unreliable. I would ask, Aunt Constance, that you consider carefully whether your concerns regarding Miss Hartley's presence in this household have perhaps colored your judgment in this matter." The Duchess rose stiffly from her chair, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and wounded pride. "I see my concerns count for little in this household these days," she said coldly, before sweeping from the room without another word, her burgundy skirts rustling sharply against the polished floor. Once she had departed, the Duke turned to Eleanor, his expression softening considerably, with evident relief and something close to genuine remorse. "Miss Hartley, I owe you a sincere apology for the distress this evening has caused you. I should have questioned my aunt's claims more thoroughly before allowing the matter to progress this far." "You need not apologize, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though her voice trembled slightly with the lingering aftermath of fear and relief. "You conducted the matter fairly, and that is more than I could have reasonably hoped for." The Duke studied her for a long moment, something warm and sincere passing between them in the quiet study, lit only by the gentle glow of the fireplace. "I confess, Miss Hartley, I find myself increasingly troubled by my aunt's evident determination to see you removed from this household, and equally troubled by the realization that I have come to value your presence here far more than I initially anticipated, both for Grace's sake and, if I am entirely honest, for my own." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his candid admission, uncertain how to respond to such an unexpected and deeply personal confession. "Your Grace, Please," he said gently, raising a hand to stop her, "you need not respond tonight. I only wished you to know that whatever schemes my aunt may continue to pursue, you have my full trust and my genuine gratitude for the care and devotion you have shown my daughter, and, I dare say, for the quiet strength of character you have shown throughout this entire ordeal." Eleanor left the study that evening with her heart in considerable turmoil, torn between profound relief at having been cleared of the false accusation, and an unsettling awareness that her feelings toward the Duke had grown far deeper and more complicated than she had ever intended or expected. Yet even as she found comfort in his evident trust and growing affection, she understood, with quiet certainty, that the Dowager Duchess Constance would not so easily accept this latest defeat, and that the true resolution of this conflict, whatever form it might eventually take, still lay somewhere ahead in the uncertain days to come. In the days that followed the tense confrontation in the Duke's study, a quiet search was conducted throughout the manor, led discreetly by Mrs. Pemberton at the Duke's request, in hopes of locating the missing sapphire brooch and finally putting the unpleasant matter to rest. Eleanor tried her best to continue her routine with Grace as though nothing troubling had occurred, though she remained keenly aware of the watchful eyes of certain household staff who still regarded her with lingering suspicion, unwilling to fully abandon the notion that a governess of humble origins might, after all, prove capable of dishonesty. It was Alice, the young maid who had shown Eleanor kindness since her very first days at Ashworth Manor, who ultimately uncovered the truth behind the missing jewelry, quite by accident, while tidying the Duchess's private sitting room one afternoon. Reaching behind a heavy velvet cushion to retrieve a dropped embroidery needle, Alice's fingers brushed against something small and hard wedged into the gap between the cushion and the chair's wooden frame. To her considerable astonishment, she withdrew the very sapphire brooch that had caused such upheaval within the household, evidently having slipped from its resting place weeks earlier and fallen unnoticed into the crevice of the Duchess's favorite chair. Alice brought the brooch immediately to Mrs. Pemberton, who in turn presented it to the Duke without delay, along with a full account of precisely where and how it had been discovered. Eleanor learned of this development from Grace, who came bounding into the schoolroom that same afternoon, breathless with excitement. "They found the brooch, Miss Eleanor," Grace announced triumphantly. "Alice found it stuck in Grandaunt Constance's chair. Father says it was there the whole time, and no one took it at all." Relief flooded through Eleanor at this news, along with a quiet, bittersweet satisfaction that her innocence had finally been proven, beyond any reasonable doubt, though she felt little triumph over the Duchess's evident error, only a tired hope that the matter might finally be laid to rest, and that peace might return to the household she had grown genuinely fond of. The Duke sought Eleanor out later that same day, finding her in the garden with Grace, who had run ahead to chase a particularly colorful butterfly among the late-blooming flowers. His expression carried a mixture of relief and quiet resolve as he approached. "I trust you have heard the news," he said, a faint smile touching his lips, despite the seriousness of his tone. "The brooch has been found, precisely where it fell weeks ago, entirely unrelated to your presence in this household or anyone else's actions." "I am relieved beyond words, Your Grace," Eleanor admitted honestly. "Though I confess, I never doubted the truth would eventually come to light." "Your composure throughout this entire ordeal has been remarkable," the Duke said, studying her with evident admiration. "Many in your position might have grown bitter or resentful, yet you have shown nothing but quiet dignity and continued devotion to my daughter, despite the unjust suspicion cast upon you. I confess, Miss Hartley, my respect and my regard for you have only deepened through these difficult weeks." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at his sincere words, though she remained uncertain how to respond to the growing warmth she sensed developing between them, warmth that both thrilled and frightened her in equal measure, given the vast difference in their respective stations, and the very real dangers such feelings might invite, particularly given the Dowager Duchess's evident hostility. As for Constance herself, news of the brooch's discovery reached her privately, delivered by her own maid Beatrice with considerable trepidation, given the Duchess's evident temper and pride. Though Eleanor did not witness the Duchess's reaction firsthand, Mrs. Pemberton later confided that the older woman had retreated into a stony, uncharacteristic silence upon learning the truth, her earlier certainty regarding Eleanor's supposed dishonesty proven not merely mistaken, but entirely without foundation from the very beginning. For several days following this revelation, Constance remained largely absent from the household's daily activities, keeping to her private chambers and declining even her customary evening visits to the drawing room. Eleanor, though relieved by this reprieve from the Duchess's watchful hostility, remained cautious, understanding well enough that a woman of such fierce pride would not easily forgive the public embarrassment of having pursued a false accusation so aggressively, nor would she likely abandon her broader opposition to Eleanor's continued presence within the household, simply because one particular scheme had unraveled. Indeed, when Constance finally emerged from her self-imposed seclusion nearly a week later, she sought out Eleanor directly, finding her alone in the library one quiet afternoon while Grace napped upstairs. Eleanor rose immediately upon the Duchess's entrance, bracing herself for further hostility, though she found, to her considerable surprise, that the older woman's demeanor carried none of its usual sharp edges. "Miss Hartley," Constance said stiffly, her eyes fixed somewhere just past Eleanor's shoulder, rather than meeting her gaze directly. "I owe you an acknowledgement, however difficult it proves for me to offer it. I was mistaken regarding the missing brooch, and my accusations against you were, I now understand, entirely without merit." Eleanor remained silent for a moment, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected admission, though she recognized, with quiet perceptiveness, the considerable effort such words must have cost a woman so deeply invested in her own pride and authority. "I appreciate your honesty, Your Grace," Eleanor said carefully. "I understand that you acted out of concern for your family, even if your suspicions proved unfounded." Constance's expression flickered with something almost like surprise at Eleanor's measured, gracious response, though her rigid posture did not fully relax. "I will not pretend my concerns regarding your position within this household have entirely vanished, Miss Hartley. I still believe a governess of uncertain background occupies an unusual and potentially precarious place within a family of our standing. But I recognize now that my methods in expressing these concerns were unbecoming of my station, and I do not wish to see this family's reputation further tarnished by continued conflict. It was, Eleanor understood, as close to an apology as the proud Dowager Duchess was likely ever to offer, and she accepted it graciously, sensing that pressing further might only reignite old hostilities rather than encourage any genuine reconciliation. I have no wish to bring conflict or scandal upon this family, Your Grace. My only concern has ever been Lady Grace's happiness and well-being. Constance studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind her sharp eyes, before she gave a single, curt nod and departed the library without further comment, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts, uncertain whether true peace had finally been achieved, or merely a fragile, temporary truce. In the weeks that followed, the household gradually settled into a calmer, more harmonious rhythm than Eleanor had known since her very first days at Ashworth Manor. Constance, while never entirely warm toward Eleanor, ceased her open hostility, offering instead a cool, but civil courtesy that Eleanor accepted gratefully, understanding it as the best resolution she might reasonably hope for given the circumstances. The wider household staff, having witnessed the full unraveling of the false accusation against her, treated Eleanor with renewed warmth and respect, and even those who had previously harbored doubts about her character found themselves won over by her continued patience, kindness, and evident devotion to young Grace. The Duke, meanwhile, found increasing occasions to seek out Eleanor's company beyond the necessary interactions required by Grace's care, walking with her often in the gardens during quiet afternoons, engaging her in thoughtful conversation about literature, philosophy, and the gentle art of raising a grieving child through difficult years. Eleanor found herself looking forward to these conversations, with an eagerness she tried, with limited success, to temper with practical caution, reminding herself constantly of the vast difference in their respective stations, and the very real scandal that might arise, should their growing mutual affection become more widely known or acknowledged. Yet despite her careful efforts at restraint, Eleanor could not deny the warmth that filled her heart whenever the Duke's gaze lingered upon her a moment longer than strictly necessary, nor the quiet contentment she felt in his steady, thoughtful company, so different from the cold formality she had expected upon first arriving at Ashworth Manor, all those weeks before. She understood, with a mixture of hope and considerable apprehension, that whatever connection had begun to form between them that fateful evening at the dinner table had continued to deepen steadily in the time since, evolving from simple gratitude and quiet respect into something far more profound, something neither of them had anticipated, nor, perhaps, could easily deny much longer. It was on a mild autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted lazily across the manor's expansive gardens, that the Duke finally gave voice to the feelings he had carried quietly for weeks, setting in motion the final events that would forever determine Eleanor Hartley's place within the grand and storied halls of Ashworth Manor. The autumn evening carried a gentle chill, and Eleanor had wrapped a light shawl around her shoulders as she walked with Grace along the winding garden paths, watching the child gather fallen leaves of red and gold into a small, delighted pile. The Duke had joined them partway through their walk, as had become his increasingly frequent habit, and the three of them made an unhurried procession through the quiet grounds, Grace chattering happily between them about the shapes of clouds and the names of birds Eleanor had taught her. When Grace eventually grew tired and was carried off to bed by a waiting nursemaid, Eleanor remained behind in the garden, intending to enjoy a few final quiet moments before returning indoors herself. The Duke lingered as well, standing beside her near a low stone wall overlooking the estate's distant hills, now bathed in the soft amber light of the setting sun. "Eleanor," he said quietly, using her given name for the first time since her arrival, a small but significant intimacy that made her breath catch slightly. "I hope you do not mind my informality this evening. I find myself struggling to maintain the proper distance my station demands, particularly where you are concerned." Eleanor turned to face him fully, her heart beating rapidly at the unexpected tenderness in his tone. "I do not mind at all, Your Grace, though I confess, I have often wondered whether such informality between us would be considered improper, given our respective positions." "Propriety," the Duke said with a faint, wry smile, "has never troubled me quite so much as it perhaps should, particularly not since the evening I first watched you endure my aunt's cruelty with such remarkable grace and dignity. I have thought of little else in the weeks since, Eleanor, and I find I can no longer pretend that my feelings toward you are simply those of gratitude or respect, however genuine those feelings may also be. Eleanor's pulse quickened, uncertain hope and cautious apprehension warring within her chest. Your Grace, please, he said gently, reaching to take her hand in his touch warm and steady, despite the cool evening air. Allow me to finish, for I have rehearsed these words more times than I care to admit, and I fear, if I do not speak them now, my courage may fail me entirely. Eleanor, from the very first days of your arrival at Ashworth Manor, I noticed something in you, a quiet strength, a genuine warmth toward my daughter, that I had feared she might never again experience following her mother's passing. I watched you endure unkindness with a grace few could manage, and I watched you continue to show grace, and indeed this entire household, nothing but patience and devotion, regardless of the difficulties placed before you. I find, quite simply, that I have fallen deeply in love with you, and I would consider myself the most fortunate man in all of England were you to accept my hand in marriage. Eleanor stood frozen for a long moment, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes, as the weight of his words settled over her, equal parts joy and overwhelming disbelief. Your Grace, I hardly know what to say. I am a governess, a woman of no fortune, no family name of any consequence. Surely such a match would bring considerable scandal upon your family, upon Grace's future standing within society. I have considered all of that carefully, Eleanor, the Duke replied, his grip on her hand tightening gently, and I find that I care far less for scandal or society's opinion than I do for genuine happiness, both my own and Grace's. My daughter loves you as she has loved no one since her mother's passing, and I have come to love you just as deeply, if not more so. Whatever difficulties our marriage might invite from society's judgment, I believe we might weather them together, far more easily than either of us has weathered our respective griefs alone these past years. Eleanor felt the last of her careful restraint crumble beneath the sincerity of his words, and she allowed herself, for the first time since her father's passing, to fully embrace the possibility of genuine happiness rather than mere survival. Then my answer, Your Grace, is yes. I would be honored beyond words to become your wife, and Grace's mother in every sense that truly matters. The Duke's expression broke into a wide, genuine smile, the first Eleanor had seen from him since her arrival, unguarded and full of quiet joy. He lifted her hand gently to his lips, pressing a soft kiss against her knuckles before drawing her into a warm, tender embrace beneath the darkening evening sky. You have made me happier tonight than I believed myself capable of feeling again, he said softly against her hair. I only hope you understand what you are agreeing to, Eleanor. There will be those, my aunt foremost among them, who will not easily accept this match, who will question your worthiness, your background, your very right to stand beside me as my wife. I understand, Eleanor said, drawing back slightly to meet his gaze with quiet determination, but I have faced unkindness before, Your Grace, and I have survived it with my dignity intact. I do not fear it now, not when I have you, and Grace, and the genuine happiness I have found within these walls I once believed I would only ever be permitted to move through as an invisible shadow. They remained in the garden a while longer, speaking quietly of the future, of how and when they might announce their engagement, of the practical considerations involved in elevating a humble governess to the rank of Duchess, before finally returning indoors, as full darkness settled over the estate. Neither of them yet knew precisely how the wider household, or the county's watchful society, would receive news of their engagement, though both understood, with quiet resolve, that they intended to face whatever challenges lay ahead together, united by a bond that had grown steadily stronger through every hardship placed before it. The following morning, the Duke gathered the household staff and, in a private audience, informed his aunt of his intentions before the news could spread through less careful channels. Constance received the announcement with visible shock, her face paling considerably as the full weight of her nephew's decision settled over her. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "A governess, nephew." "You intend to make a governess the next Duchess of Ashworth." "I intend to marry the woman I love," the Duke replied calmly, though firmly. "A woman who has shown more genuine kindness, patience, and integrity than anyone I have encountered in years, myself included. I understand this decision troubles you, Aunt Constance, but I ask that you consider, in time, extending Eleanor the same courtesy and respect she has shown you and this household, despite every unkindness placed before her. Constance said nothing further in that moment, retreating instead into a stunned, troubled silence, though Eleanor, watching quietly from a respectful distance, understood that true reconciliation, if it came at all, would require considerable time and patience on everyone's part. Yet she felt, for the first time since her arrival at Ashworth Manor, a genuine sense of belonging and hope settling firmly within her heart, unshaken by whatever difficulties still lay ahead, secure in the knowledge that she had found, against every expectation, a place where she was truly seen, truly valued, and truly loved. News of the engagement spread through the county with remarkable speed, carried from household to household by servants, guests, and the ever-watchful eyes of local society. As Eleanor had feared, the announcement stirred no small measure of scandal among certain circles, particularly those families who had long looked to the Dowager Duchess for guidance on matters of proper conduct and social standing. Whispers followed Eleanor whenever she ventured beyond the manor's walls, curious glances and hushed conversations trailing in her wake, though she found, with growing confidence, that she cared far less for such gossip than she might once have expected, secure in the genuine love and support of both the Duke and young Grace. Not everyone within the county proved unkind, however. Several families who had witnessed the original dinner incident, and the Duke's subsequent gallant defense of Eleanor's character, spoke warmly of the engagement, praising the Duke's evident wisdom in choosing character and genuine devotion over mere rank and fortune. Mr. Whitfield, the kindly gentleman who had first engaged Eleanor in pleasant conversation at the tea gathering, sent a warm letter of congratulations, expressing his genuine delight at the match and his confidence that Eleanor would prove a worthy and beloved Duchess. Grace, for her part, greeted the news of her father's engagement with unrestrained joy, throwing her small arms around Eleanor's waist the moment she learned that her beloved governess would soon become her mother, in truth as well as in spirit. "I always knew you would stay forever," Grace declared happily, her earlier fears of abandonment finally laid fully to rest. "Now you truly will." Eleanor held the child close, blinking back tears of overwhelming happiness. "I will never leave you, Grace. Not for anything in this world. You have my word." The wedding preparations that followed occupied the household for several busy weeks, though Eleanor insisted, against the Duke's initial protests, upon a modest and dignified ceremony, rather than the grand, extravagant affair typically expected of noble unions. She had no wish, she explained gently, to invite further scandal or resentment through an ostentatious display, preferring instead a smaller gathering of genuine friends and well-wishers, along with the household staff who had shown her such kindness during her difficult early weeks at Ashworth Manor. The Duke, understanding and respecting her wishes, agreed readily, and together they planned a quiet ceremony to be held in the manor's small private chapel, attended only by close friends, trusted staff, and, somewhat to Eleanor's surprise, the Dowager Duchess Constance herself, who, though still visibly uncertain about the match, had gradually softened her opposition in the weeks since the initial announcement. The change in Constance's demeanor had come slowly, prompted in no small part by a private conversation Eleanor had initiated with her some weeks before the wedding, seeking the older woman out in her private sitting room one quiet afternoon, determined to address their difficult history directly, rather than allow lingering resentment to fester unaddressed into the future. "Your Grace," Eleanor had begun carefully, finding Constance seated near her window, embroidery resting untouched in her lap. "I understand that this match brings you considerable discomfort, and I do not wish to cause further division within this family through my presence here. I have come to ask, quite honestly, whether there is anything I might do to ease your concerns, or to demonstrate more fully my genuine commitment to this family's welfare and happiness." Constance had studied her for a long, silent moment, her expression carefully guarded, before finally setting aside her embroidery entirely. "Miss Hartley, I will admit, I have spent considerable time these past weeks examining my own reasons for opposing this match so fiercely. I told myself, initially, that my concerns centered entirely upon matters of proper rank and family honor. Yet I have come to understand, through quiet reflection, that my true fears ran considerably deeper." "What fears, Your Grace, if I may ask?" Eleanor had inquired gently. Constance's composure had wavered slightly, revealing a vulnerability Eleanor had never before glimpsed beneath the woman's typically formidable exterior. "I lost my own husband many years ago, Miss Hartley, and I have watched this family endure grief after grief since, my nephew's own wife passing far too young, leaving him and dear Grace in such profound sorrow. I suppose I feared, quite irrationally perhaps, that opening our hearts once again to new love might only invite further heartbreak, further loss, further disruption to whatever fragile stability we had managed to rebuild. It was easier, I told myself, to guard against such vulnerability, through strict adherence to rank and propriety, than to risk my heart, or my family's heart, once again. Eleanor had felt a wave of genuine sympathy at this admission, understanding, perhaps better than most, the particular fear of loving deeply only to risk profound loss, having endured such grief herself following her own father's passing. Your Grace, I cannot promise that love comes without risk, for I believe it always does, in some measure. But I can promise you this: I love your nephew, and I love Grace, with a depth and sincerity that has nothing whatsoever to do with rank, fortune, or family name. I only wish to see this family happy and whole once more, and I would consider it an honor, truly, to earn your trust, and perhaps, in time, your genuine friendship as well. Constance had said little in immediate response, though something in her rigid posture had softened noticeably, and in the weeks that followed, Eleanor noticed small, gradual signs of genuine thaw in the older woman's demeanor, quiet gestures of acceptance that spoke louder than any formal apology ever could. Constance began joining Eleanor and Grace occasionally, during afternoon walks in the garden, offering measured but genuine praise for Eleanor's patient teaching methods, and even, on one memorable occasion, sharing a rare, warm smile as she watched Grace giggle happily over a shared joke between the three of them. By the time the wedding day finally arrived, bright and clear beneath a crisp autumn sky, Constance had, if not fully embraced the match, at least come to accept it with genuine, if reserved, goodwill. She sat in the small chapel's front pew alongside close family friends and trusted household staff, her expression, for once, free of its usual sharp edges, as she watched her nephew stand at the altar, waiting with evident joy and anticipation for his bride. Eleanor walked down the modest aisle in a simple gown of soft ivory, far less elaborate than the grand wedding attire typically expected of noble brides, though she had never felt more beautiful, nor more genuinely happy in all her life. Grace walked just ahead of her, scattering flower petals with delighted concentration, occasionally glancing back over her shoulder with a bright, proud smile that warmed Eleanor's heart considerably. The ceremony itself passed in a warm, joyful blur, the small gathering of witnesses offering genuine smiles and quiet tears of happiness as the Duke and Eleanor exchanged their vows before the chapel's modest altar, promising to support and cherish one another through whatever difficulties life might yet bring. When the Duke finally kissed his new bride, a soft cheer rose from the assembled guests, and even Constance, Eleanor noticed with quiet surprise, dabbed briefly at her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief, her earlier reservations seemingly dissolved entirely in the genuine warmth of the occasion. The small celebration that followed the ceremony carried none of the tension and cruelty that had marked Eleanor's very first dinner within these walls, replaced instead by genuine laughter, warm conversation, and the quiet contentment of a household finally at peace with itself. Servants who had once regarded Eleanor with cautious uncertainty now offered genuine congratulations and warm well wishes, while guests who had witnessed her earlier humiliation at that fateful dinner party now toasted her happiness with evident sincerity. As the celebration wound down into the quiet hours of early evening, Eleanor found herself standing once again upon the garden terrace where the Duke had first confessed his feelings for her, now dressed not as a humble governess, but as the newly wedded Duchess of Ashworth, her husband's arm wrapped warmly around her waist as they watched the last light of day fade gently over the estate's rolling hills. "Do you remember," the Duke said softly, "the evening you first arrived here, frightened and uncertain, believing yourself destined only for a quiet, invisible existence within these walls?" "I remember it well," Eleanor replied with a fond, thoughtful smile. "I never could have imagined, that rainy evening, that I would stand here today, not as a governess hiding in the shadows, but as your wife, cherished and valued beyond anything I once dared to hope for." "You have always deserved far more than the shadows, Eleanor," the Duke said tenderly, drawing her closer. "I only regret it took my aunt's cruelty to finally show me the depth of character and grace you possessed all along." Eleanor rested her head gently against his shoulder, watching Grace chase fireflies across the darkening lawn below, her joyful laughter carrying warmly through the cool evening air. "Perhaps," she said softly, "some difficult beginnings are simply necessary to reveal the true strength of the happiness that follows." Behind them, unseen in the growing darkness, Constance watched quietly from a nearby window, her expression, for the first time in many years, entirely free of bitterness or resentment, replaced instead by a genuine, if still somewhat reserved, sense of hope for the family's future, and for the unexpected, remarkable woman who had somehow, against every obstacle placed before her, found her rightful place among them, not through scheming or ambition, but through simple, unwavering kindness, patience, and quiet, unshakable dignity. The years that followed brought a quiet, steady happiness to Ashworth Manor that its walls had not known in a very long time. Eleanor settled into her new role as Duchess with the same patient grace she had shown as a governess, never losing the humility that had first drawn the Duke's admiration, nor forgetting the hardships that had once shaped her early life. She continued to spend her mornings with Grace, though lessons in letters and numbers gradually gave way to lessons in kindness, patience, and quiet strength, values Eleanor considered far more important than any noble title. Grace grew from a fearful, grieving child into a bright, confident young girl, her earlier sorrow softened by the steady love of both her father and the woman she now called mother in every meaningful sense. She often told visitors, with unashamed pride, the story of the evening her father had walked the length of the dinner table to stand beside the woman who would one day become her mother, a story that grew, with each retelling, into something of a cherished family legend, spoken of fondly at gatherings for years to come. Constance, too, found unexpected peace in the years that followed, her early reservations giving way gradually to genuine affection and respect for her nephew's wife. She became, in time, an unlikely but devoted grandmother figure to Grace, and later to the children Eleanor and the Duke welcomed into their growing family, teaching them proper etiquette and manners with the same firm authority she had once wielded so sharply against Eleanor, though now tempered considerably by warmth and genuine care. She never fully abandoned her sharp tongue, nor her occasional pointed remarks about propriety and station, but those who knew her well recognized, beneath the familiar bluster, a woman who had learned, later in life than most, the true value of judging others by their character rather than their birth. Word of the Duke's remarkable marriage traveled throughout the county and beyond, inspiring quiet conversations among other noble families regarding the nature of true worth and genuine character. Some remained skeptical, clinging stubbornly to old notions of rank and privilege, but many others, particularly the younger generation, found themselves genuinely inspired by the story of a humble governess who had risen not through scheming or fortune, but through simple kindness, unwavering dignity, and quiet courage in the face of cruelty. Eleanor never forgot her humble origins, nor the difficult years following her father's death, when she had wondered, with genuine fear, whether she might spend her entire life unseen and unvalued, moving quietly through the grand houses of others, without ever truly belonging anywhere. She used her new position, in time, to establish a small charitable fund, supporting the education of orphaned and impoverished young women throughout the county, ensuring that others facing circumstances similar to her own might find opportunities for genuine advancement and dignity, rather than mere survival at the margins of society. The Duke, for his part, found in Eleanor not merely a devoted wife and loving mother to his daughter, but a genuine partner in every sense, someone whose quiet wisdom and steady moral compass guided him through the responsibilities of managing his estate and caring for his tenants with far greater compassion and fairness than he might otherwise have shown. Their marriage, born from an act of public defense against cruel injustice, grew steadily into a deep, abiding partnership built upon mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values that neither rank nor fortune could ever fully capture. Many years later, when Grace herself grew into a young woman preparing for her own future, she would often ask her mother to recount the story of that fateful dinner. The evening cruelty had been met not with retreat or despair, but with quiet dignity, ultimately rewarded by genuine love and lasting happiness. Eleanor would smile softly each time she told the tale, reminding her daughter gently that true worth was never measured by wealth, title, or the judgment of others, but by the simple, steady strength of one's own character, and by the courage to remain kind and honest, even when the world around you seemed determined to treat you otherwise. And so, within the grand halls of Ashworth Manor, where a proud duchess had once sought to humiliate a poor governess, before an entire gathering of noble guests, there grew instead a lasting legacy of compassion, dignity, and genuine love, a quiet testament to the enduring truth that kindness, however humble its origins, has the power to transform even the coldest of houses into a home filled with warmth, acceptance, and lasting happiness for generations to come.